let's talk about the R.A.S.E model. The R.A.S.E model is based on this principle. I wondered, as I examined and looked at the research around executive presence, as I worked with executives, either as an executive coach or a colleague, et cetera, I wondered, why is it that we all know people who have a really strong executive presence? I mean, they're in a room and you're just like, oh, wow, they're good, right? We all know people like that, right? It's the way that they come across, the way that they represent themselves. And I wondered, what's the science behind that? And that led me to this. The R.A.S.E model is basically based on 4 questions that everybody's brain asks themselves about someone else. Now, it's one thing if John thinks he has executive presence. It's an entirely different thing if no one else thinks he has executive presence. Yeah, I know. We know those people as well. Don't look at them if they're in the room. But what are the questions that the human brain is going through to determine whether or not you or I have executive presence? Every brain, every time, it's going to run through these 4 questions. Now, clearly, this isn't necessarily happening here, which we call the prefrontal cortex, sits right here at the front of your head. This is where executive processing occurs, right? Think emotional regulation, problem solving, deep analytical thinking, right? I'm using the prefrontal cortex for that. This isn't necessarily happening there. In fact, it's happening so fast that it's happening in other areas of the brain that we refer to as a non-conscious space of the brain. Let's spend some time looking at those 4 questions. And let's be thinking about, boy, how do I show up in these particular spaces? So the first is resolution. The second is authenticity. Then you see simplicity on the screen. And the last is EQ, or EI. We tend to use them interchangeably, but in the science regions, they actually are different. Emotional intelligence is different than emotional quotient, but we interlace them together. And for today's conversation, we'll keep it simple.